Again, I don't want to insult Europe today, but I would say that the victorious European coalition that defeated Napoleon and then gathered at this conclave called the Congress of Vienna had more in concert and was called the Concert of Powers. They were more capable of acting together than the European Union, which has a gigantic bureaucracy and a constitution and all sorts of capabilities that are imprinted onto the circuit board. And yet they don't seem to be capable of anything.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius in Londinium. It is warming a little. Spring is here. The Thames is, as usual, gray and turbulent. I'm sitting with my good colleague Germanicus. We have our cup of wine, second cup actually. We're going on to sacrifice to Augustus later. And then we hope for a comedy. However, it's likely to be a tragedy. We're discussing the events of these last days in the 21st century. The century we live in is very secure. There'll be some rocky times when Domitian, our emperor, is stabbed by a collection of servants. However, after that comes Nerva, and then we are confident for a good century at least. And that's why we're going to the 21st century, because there's nothing confident right now with a new president, emperor in Washington, and a troubled land, Ukraine. I read the headlines from London in these last hours. Trump, Ukraine, quote, may not survive. This is the opinion of the president, emperor, Mr. Trump. Also, allies cannot be dragooned into a coalition of the willing, says a senior minister in London at Whitehall. Also, Russian special forces crawl through gas pipelines to ambush Ukrainians on video. Also, European rearmament is a losing bet. That's a market observer. And this is my favorite. Elon Musk claims Ukraine front line will collapse if Starlink is turned off. I'm speaking on Starlink right now, and my expectation is that it will not be turned off. I paid my bill. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much. The Ukraine situation has now fallen into something that we can predict. Mr. Trump has directed his counselors to cease supplying Ukraine with false hope, rearmament, intelligence, surveillance, satellite communication. Ukraine is reminding me of that movie Gladiator at the turn of the 20th to the 21st century, in the opening scene when the two Roman generals are shaking their heads at the inability of the Germans to surrender to a superior military force, the Roman legions. I'm inspired by this scene all the time. I watch it again and again. I don't watch the movie, I just that scene. And the quote that I remember, paraphrase, is, why don't these people know when they're beaten? And the response from our hero is, would you? Would I? Well, as a matter of fact, it is hard to see when you're beaten. And right now it would appear that the Ukrainians cannot see the facts. Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, guys. A few months ago, and you can see it in a recent article I wrote about Ukrainian losses, I was comparing the situation of Ukraine to that of the Confederacy and the very long 60 miles of fortified entrenchments that stretched from Richmond all the way down to Petersburg. And my point, comparing that to, say, the similar kind of fortifications in Donbass, that the situation of the Ukrainian army, and thus of Ukraine as a whole, it was very much like that of the Confederacy as it entered into the fall of 1864. Things were frozen. You could say it was a stalemate, but in reality, the drain, the attritional drain on the South, on the Army of Northern Virginia, was constant. And I would say, thus, that today it's the late winter or early spring, potentially, of 1865. And at that point, the Confederacy and the Army of Northern Virginia not only did they look like scarecrows, they were their numbers had declined markedly from desertion and from losses. And I see the situation in Ukraine as being just like that. And in fact, the critical battle now ongoing in the Kursk region, which, as we recall, was seized, and this is Russian territory, of course. This was seized in order to create a bargaining chip for Ukraine in any kind of peace negotiations. Well, it's all being lost now, but more important are the number of men who've been lost in that cauldron. It's like a mini Stalingrad in the sense that there are thousands of Ukrainian soldiers now trapped in that little Kursk pocket. And they'll either have to surrender or die. And what we're watching now is a kind of, if you can imagine the reverse of a beacon or a flare, it's a kind of the dark sump signal to the rest of Ukraine that this war is lost. And this is one of those signal moments. And this was the process that sort of went in train as the Civil War entered into the month of March and then into April, and it was not possible to hold the lines anymore. And I think we're reaching that point now. So the actual coming apart of the Ukrainian army, I think, is very close. And the whole point of the defeat in Kursk is twofold. First of all, it was their last hope to have any kind of leverage in a negotiation involving Russia. And the other part is that so much was made of it and so much has been lost in it. Effectively, by going into Kursk, Ukraine has lost uh, the best of its army. And we're talking upwards of 80,000 or more irrecoverable casualties or prisoners. And we don't know, looking over the whole front, what the desertion levels are like right now, but they're quite large. I mean, a few months ago, they were talking about 120,000 for the year, and now it could be much, much greater, and it will be like a hemorrhage that gathers increasing velocity. So that we're really at a hinge point now.
The end. For the Confederacy, since you choose Petersburg and Richmond, the siege, I remember the mocking headline from the Tribune in New York was, Lee has Grant just where he wants him, on all sides. They were starving, and the army was broken, and they wanted to break out, and they tried it, and were interrupted in their fleeing to the west, and the signature at Appomattox Courthouse ended the Army of Northern Virginia. It surrendered its arms. However, the government of the Confederate States of America did not surrender. Jeff Davis, the former senator, former Secretary of War, man who was born in Kentucky in a log cabin just like Abraham Lincoln, but he grew up to be a slave master, he fled. And he was captured by Union cavalry, I believe, somewhere in Georgia is my memory, but perhaps not. And at the time, he was accused of wearing a woman's dress to get away. Later on, it emerged that he had a shawl on. In any event, he was imprisoned for some years and tried for treason. I think he was imprisoned in a fort off of Florida, is my
Yeah,
remember.
Fort Monroe in Virginia. I went and looked at his cell, just to sort of note that this was an important sort of coda to
Right.
the terrible war. Yeah.
And then they let him go. They didn't.
It wouldn't bring him to trial. That's very important.
The reason I made Jeff Davis is that Mr. Zelensky begins to resemble the leader of a country or a nation, or a tribe, or a group, or a territory who refuses to acknowledge the obvious and negotiate. Hence, we were told that he would sign the document at the White House, and he did not. Hence, we were told that he would attend Saudi Arabia coterminous with his aides and Mr. Trump's aides to negotiate the end of the war, and Mr. Zelensky did not, or at least the headline says he did not.
Yeah.
Now we have a headline saying that Mr. Zelensky is looking to convince the Trump administration to turn surveillance back on. Mr. Zelensky doesn't want to surrender. He has his motives, I understand, so did Jeff Davis. Without a surrender, however, Ukraine is left without a leader. Unless, is there an alternative for them? Can they choose a leader? They haven't had an election in 2 years.
Well, I think we can put into a timeline, and not that this is how it is going to unfold precisely, but there are benchmarks or moments along the timeline into the future regarding this issue. And the key issue that he is going to have to face, and what will be undoubtedly the hinge of his decision to flee, is the moment he gets confirmation of things that are already ongoing. The British are apparently grooming Zelensky to take his place, and the U.S. is talking to people like Poroshenko. And when all that backstage business is to
And Tymoshenko, the billionaire
yeah.
female leader of the country, the
Well,
one
I mean,
who
yeah.
was jailed at some point.
Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of contenders, and when all that is resolved in the sense that it's clear that something is going to happen and it won't be Z, he is going to flee. That's the only thing he can do. Now, at the moment, I think he's counting on the kind of last hurrah ritual exercise. It was a kind of ceremonial occasion where he fled Washington into the arms of European leaders, where he was warmly embraced. And they promised to take up the slack of the U.S. abandonment of
Yeah,
Ukraine.
that's the so-called coalition of the willing, their term.
Right. And that will undoubtedly either not come through, or the Europeans will decide that they need a new guy. I mean, the UK is so active in this sort of Game of Thrones business that I could really see them. Okay, if the Europeans really feel that they have to strike out, as it were, on their own, they're also going to try and put into place a parallel leadership change who will be their guy in Kiev.
Right.
And at that point, I mean, Zelensky is relatively, I shouldn't say relatively, I'm being too diplomatic. He's been discredited in the eyes of his own people. And the current mini Stalingrad is kind of a coup de grace, I think, because the atmospherics and the pyrotechnic media aspect of the collapse of the Kursk pocket is going to kind of seal his fate. So this is what we're looking at right now.
Will Zelensky go to Paris and form a government in exile?
No, no. I mean, he can't form a government at all if he doesn't get support for that. And I think that European leaders will, if they're going to go, as it were, whole hog and take up the banner for Ukraine that the U.S. once held aloft, they're going to have their own guy in there, and they're going to have to craft some sort of replacement. And they're not going to want to stick with Zelensky if things are falling apart in Ukraine. They're going to want to come up with some kind of replacement regime plus a replacement war effort. But all of this is speculation because at the moment, it's not clear that Europe is capable of.
Let's go to Europe, Germanicus, because they're the story that continues.
Mhm.
Zelensky does not. The emergency meetings that have happened so much, I've lost count, have pointed to the fact that Europe is not in a position to be able to defend itself. And that makes certain parts of Europe nervous, other parts of it not so much. However, right now, we're not here to rearm Europe. We're here to say that there are 750 million people who have watched their economies wither over these last 3 years of active war fighting in Ukraine and 11, 12 years of the conflict in Ukraine, starting with the little green men in Crimea. And what is to be done for those 750 million people? There is a defense industry to reignite, and that will contribute to the GDP growth. But there is no stability as long as the collective leadership, and certainly the the big four, that would be London, Paris, Berlin, and Rome. The big four look upon the future as a conflict with the United States. Germanicus, Europe is disappointed in the United States. Disappointed because, according to Europe, according to these collective voices of Brussels, the U.S. is breaking a bargain that has been in place for 80 years, oddly. And the Europeans are convinced that it can't be stopped, that Mr. Trump and his Trump administration is adamant. And I've heard talk that they're going to wait this out. I read a document from the New Yorker, which is first-rate voices of the resistance to Mr. Trump. First rate. This is David Remnick talking to the distinguished historian Stephen Kotkin. The question is, how is Vladimir Putin reading this situation? How is he watching Washington, and what does he want? And Professor Kotkin says, Russia's grand strategy for, I don't know, 3 centuries, that would be to Catherine, I believe, has been the following. West decline. Have the West implode and collapse, and then we'll survive. That's Russian grand strategy. Things are bad in Russia. They're horrible in Russia. But hey, if the West implodes, if the West defeats itself, if the West is undermining its own policies and strengths, then Russia will be okay. This is your fear. This is what you're talking about. That Trump is doing Putin's work for him. Germanicus, this sounds a whole lot like Russiagate, is it?
Well, it's an interesting story. It's a nice fantasy. It again, I think I mentioned Game of Thrones earlier, and it's like Game of Thrones. It's a boogeyman that's been created as part of an exciting narrative of good versus evil, schemers versus the upright and virtuous, et cetera, et cetera. And it bears no tangency, not just no correspondence, but no tangent point with actual reality, whether it's history or the situation today. So Europe feels betrayed by the United States breaching this compact that it's had for 80 years. But that compact was to defend Europe against Soviet communism. That's long gone. And the entire adventure in Ukraine was created by European countries led by the United States. And it was a very different venture. It was a venture that bore no relation to the activities, to the entire enterprise and mission of NATO during the Cold War, which was defensive. And this is a more aggressive strategy. And so, what Europe is inheriting without the United States, if they wish to take up the standard, is they're inheriting um, an aggressive strategy against Russia that they must continue if they pick that standard up. And at this point, European defense, and this point must be made clear, and it is not being made clear. European defense is about maintaining what has been an aggressive move against Russia, strategic move. It is not about defending Europe. It is about a an offensive strategy, and they're deciding to continue that. And so it's not about European defense in some generalized, decontextualized situation. I mean, Europe has everything it needs to defend itself, But this isn't about defense. This is about offense. The situation in Ukraine is about Europe putting itself, as it has been with the US up till now, but without the US, it's Europe putting itself, a united Europe putting itself in the same situation geographically and ideologically in terms of its goals. Not precisely, but it's doing the same thing as the last European Union. The first European Union was created under the aegis of the Third Reich, and it was fighting at Kursk. And the European Union today fighting at Kursk. And it's a shocking irony in many ways. But I was just looking at X, and there was a little, tweet, and it had a helmet from the battlefield of Kursk in World War II with the SS runes. And then beneath it was the image of a Ukrainian helmet with SS runes in the same spot on the side of the helmet. It's a resonant image that is difficult for Europe, and Europe doesn't want to address this difficulty. Neither, obviously, does Mr. Remnick or Mr. Kotkin. And effectively, Europe is in a wonderful position, if it wishes to pull back from this adventure, and it is not directly threatened by Russia. And if there's a large buffer space, which includes Belarus as well as potentially Ukraine, then there's no concern, I think, at all. I mean, Europe has a giant GNP, although it's been declining vis-a-vis the US for the last 20 years. In fact, the EU GDP at its inception in the early 90s was equal to the US or slightly greater. Now, the European combined GDP is half that of the US. So it's not doing all that well. And this leads, of course, to the question of how Europe would pursue a continued war effectively with the Ukrainian proxy against Russia, because they do not seem to have the excess wealth to do the kind of mobilization that they're currently advertising.
They don't have Starlink. Can we imagine Mr. Sturmer and Herr Merz,
Oh, yeah.
President
Well,
Macron, and Prime Minister Maloney traveling to Moscow and sitting with Putin and making a separate peace? Can we imagine that?
no, the problem the war has had for the last 3 years is there was never any avenue, no pathway to a negotiation at all. It was victory or
Well,
death.
Mr. Biden refused to call Moscow.
Yes. Well, he refused to call Moscow, but then all of the then vassals, I suppose they've been liberated now.
They are liberated. I'm trying to imagine them
They,
act on their
they
own. Are they equipped to act on their own?
No, because they don't have a concert. Again, I don't want to insult Europe today, but I would say that the victorious European coalition that defeated Napoleon and then gathered at this conclave called the Congress of Vienna had more in concert and was called the Concert of Powers. They were more capable of acting together than the European Union, which has a gigantic bureaucracy and a constitution and all sorts of capabilities that are imprinted onto the circuit board, and yet they don't seem to be capable of anything done as a group.
We're going to stay with, right now, a little lesson in Roman history, Roman Civil War. We fought several in the first century BCE. The third one resulted in ferocious bloodletting. One of the people who let blood was Cato, Cato the Younger, who was a troublesome person, very troublesome, in direct competition with Caesar. I don't think he had an opinion of Octavian one way or the other. Octavian would grow up to become the great god Augustus. So, Germanicus, I come to you with the lesson as I remember it in our Civil War. And we're a product of the Civil War. The Civil War ends when one side completely dominates the other without conditions at all. Total unconditional surrender. That's how our Civil War ended, and Octavian became Augustus. Our observation of other civil wars, when people revolt from us, our clients, is we give them a choice. You can die here, or you can become a slave. Again, total domination. With our legions, it's straightforward for us. Civil war in Ukraine seems to be conducting itself differently, or is it?
That is a slippery question, but one that I believe, nonetheless, can be answered. When Ukraine and Russia first encountered each other in the modern period, during the period of Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the Zaporizhian Cossacks and others, there were battles and wars. And eventually it ended with the Cossacks, who were, the proto-Ukraine, getting autonomy and swearing suzerainty to Moscow. And that worked for a long while, but it fell apart, I would argue, in World War One. And what happened was the uh, revolution, and Ukraine decided to form its own thing and go its own way. And so it was put down. And then it in World War II, with Barbarossa and the invasion of Russia by the first European Union, um, Ukraine collaborated strongly with the European coalition of armies. And Russia, the Soviets, then, after the war, had to fight a 5-year guerrilla war in Ukraine, which the U.S. financed. Again, a prototype for what's been going on today. And Ukraine never really melded with Russia. And to add even more difficulty, Stalin brought in millions of Russians into the Donbass. And so what you have today is indeed a civil war within Ukraine. But this civil war has generated so much hatred and antipathy that it doesn't seem possible that Russia would really want to try and incorporate the Ukrainian Ukraine. Now, there is the Russian Ukraine, and it is mostly incorporated right now into Russia. So there is the possibility of Ukraine and Russia going their separate ways. It's not a situation like our ancestors encountered. You remember right before the last civil wars that led to the divine Augustus, to Caesar and then Augustus, there were what were known or would be known as the social wars. In other words, the Socii, who were all of the regions around Latium and the Roman areas and colonies. They wanted full citizenship, to be citizens of Rome. They wanted to be Romans. And these Socii, who spoke similar languages, if not Latin itself, fought war with Rome. And Rome made an accommodation with them, and ultimately, after defeating them, made them Romans and full citizens. And that was a key to our later imperial success. And that would have been the approach, I think, that Russia or the Soviets would have taken as they did in the past with Ukraine. But I don't think that kind of agreement is possible anymore. I think a sharper division will exist. And so what needs to happen in order to have a general peace in Europe is for Ukraine, as it is now, or slightly smaller, who knows, will have to be a neutral entity between the European Union and Russia. That is the only, I think, path today. And fortunately, people aren't likely to think positively, but there is a positive side to this. Fortunately, the Russian part of Ukraine is now part of Russia. So it's not as though nothing has been achieved in these terrible 3 years of war. The basis for an agreement is there. The question is making sure this agreement is one that effectively separates the European Union on one hand and Russia on the other, so that war doesn't begin again. And so that means a neutral Ukraine like Austria.
Can we agree as Romans, briefly, that without an unconditional surrender, the war is not over?
I think what we're heading toward is something that approaches a surrender on the part of Ukraine. And this is what is driving not just the European Union, but also, I think, the courtiers in Washington and Mr. Trump himself crazy, because it means acknowledging that we pursued a strategic course that led to defeat yet again. And nobody in the West wants to admit or acknowledge that, but they're going to have to. And Russia will not be able to accept a settlement that does not involve some level of surrender on the part of Ukraine.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're in Londinium. Now we're going on to, we hope, a Terence play. We hope the jokes are good. Not slapstick, witty. Terence could write. Although I'm not sure about the troupe presenting it tonight. They might be Greeks. And the Greeks have a difficult time telling jokes. Even double entendres. Even puns. However, it's not their strength. They do the tragedy. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium, waiting for next week's amazing headlines from the 21st century. I'm John Batchelor.